The dying light of autumn painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in hues of amber and crimson as Margaret Maggie Walsh pulled her weathered cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Threads of gray wove through her chestnut hair, catching the last golden rays that filtered through the small window of her mountain home. Her hands, marked by years of labor, yet still graceful, moved rhythmically as she guided wool through the ancient wooden loom that had belonged to her grandmother. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, drumming a solemn melody against the tin roof. The forecast had warned of a storm, one of those fierce mountain tempests that could isolate Pinewood Valley for days. Maggie glanced toward the small bedroom where her children slept. Dylan, 12 years old with his father's stubborn chin, and Emma, 9, whose asthma worsened with each passing winter. Just 3 more orders, Maggie whispered to herself, her fingers never stopping their dance across the loom. 3 more, and I can pay for Emma's medication. 3 months had passed since the Milltown textile factory closed its doors after 60 years of operation. 20 years of Maggie's life surrendered to those industrial walls after she'd abandoned her nursing career in Boston to follow her husband's dream of mountain living. He'd left 8 years ago, vanishing like morning mist, leaving behind half-finished promises and 2 small children who still sometimes asked when Daddy was coming home. The ancient sewing machine in the corner, her lifeline now, hummed steadily as Maggie worked on completing a traditional Appalachian quilt pattern. Each stitch represented more than craftsmanship. It was survival woven into fabric. Her online store, Blue Ridge Treasures, earned just enough to keep the lights on. But winter in these mountains showed no mercy to single mothers with dwindling bank accounts. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, pulling Maggie from her reverie. She rose quickly, remembering the display of handcrafted items she'd arranged on the small porch earlier that morning, a desperate attempt to attract any passing tourists before the season ended. As she opened the front door, the full force of the storm struck her. Rain whipped sideways, driven by howling wind that seemed to carry the collective moans of the ancient mountains themselves. Lightning cracked across the darkened sky, momentarily illuminating the landscape, and 2 figures struggling up the muddy path toward her house. Maggie squinted through the downpour. An elderly woman and a small child, both drenched to the bone, were making their way toward her porch. The woman moved with uncertain steps, her silver hair plastered against her face, while the boy, no older than 6 or 7, desperately tugged at her hand, trying to guide her forward. "Good heavens," Maggie gasped, abandoning her craft display and rushing into the rain. "Come inside, quickly." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with relief and exhaustion. The elderly woman, however, stared at Maggie with confusion, her gaze unfocused. "Thomas?" the woman whispered, reaching toward Maggie with trembling fingers. "Is that you, Thomas?" Inside the modest warmth of her living room, Maggie wrapped the boy in her softest quilt, one she'd been saving to sell, and gently guided the elderly woman to sit beside the wood stove. The woman's hands were ice cold, her pulse rapid beneath Maggie's touch, instincts from Maggie's nursing days kicking in automatically. "I'm Sam," the boy said quietly, his teeth still chattering. "This is my grandma Martha. She forgets things sometimes." Martha Reynolds sat rigidly on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. "We need to get back to the car," she muttered. "Harold is waiting. Harold doesn't like to be kept waiting." Sam looked at Maggie with eyes too wise for his years. "Harold was my grandpa. He died 10 years ago." Maggie nodded, understanding washing over her. She'd seen this before during her time as a nurse, the distinctive signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, the confusion, the time slips, the searching for faces long gone. "We were going to visit my mom and dad's graves," Sam continued, his voice small but steady. "It's their anniversary. Grandma wanted to bring flowers, but our car got stuck on the road, and then she started walking away. I couldn't stop her." Maggie rummaged through Martha's soggy purse with the woman's mumbled permission, finding only an address in Atlanta, over 200 miles away, and a photograph of Martha standing beside a distinguished-looking man in his 40s. "Is this someone we should call?" Maggie asked gently. Sam nodded. "That's Uncle Bobby, Grandma's other grandson, but he doesn't come around much." Outside, the storm intensified. The mountain roads would be treacherous now, possibly impassable. Even if she called the sheriff's office, it might be hours before anyone could reach them. "You'll stay here tonight," Maggie decided, pushing aside thoughts of her dwindling pantry and the heating bill she couldn't afford to pay. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Have you ever encountered a stranger who changed your life? Share in the comments and subscribe to hear the rest of the story. As midnight approached, Martha's condition worsened. Fever claimed her, bringing with it disjointed memories that spilled from her lips like scattered beads from a broken necklace. "Robert needs to come home," Martha murmured, clutching Maggie's hand with surprising strength. "He works too hard in that city, just like his father. Always chasing something they can't name." Maggie pressed a cool cloth to Martha's forehead, her mind traveling back to similar nights when she tended to her mother during her final battle with cancer. The rhythms of caregiving returned to her body, when to offer water, how to adjust pillows, the gentle touch that communicated safety to a disoriented mind. "He never forgave his brother," Martha continued, her eyes closed but her mind obviously traveling distant corridors of memory. "After the accident, after we lost James and Sarah, Bobby just disappeared into his work. Left little Sam with me. Said he couldn't bear to look at him. Too much like James." Sam had fallen asleep on the small armchair nearby, exhaustion finally claiming him. Maggie tucked another blanket around his small shoulders, wondering what kind of man would abandon his orphaned nephew and elderly grandmother. "He built that company from nothing," Martha whispered proudly, momentarily lucid. "Heritage Craft Collections. Started because of my quilts, you know. He said the patterns reminded him of home." By dawn, Martha's fever broke. The first gray light of morning revealed a woman transformed, still physically frail but mentally present in a way she hadn't been the previous night. She sat up slowly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks as she took in her surroundings. "Oh my," she said softly, noticing Maggie dozing in the chair beside her. "What trouble I've caused." Maggie woke instantly, years of motherhood having taught her to sleep lightly. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Reynolds?" Martha's eyes widened with surprise. "You know my name." "Sam told me," Maggie explained, pouring a cup of tea from the thermos she'd prepared hours before. "And you mentioned some things during the night." Martha's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. "I have early-stage Alzheimer's," she confessed, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Some days are better than others. Yesterday wasn't good." "You should have told someone before traveling so far," Maggie said gently. Martha's eyes traveled to Sam, still sleeping peacefully. "My grandson doesn't know. Robert, Bobby, he doesn't know either. I didn't want to be a burden." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Bobby works so hard. He's built this wonderful business, but he's lost himself in it. I thought bringing Sam to his parents' resting place might help us all heal. Now look what I've done." Maggie watched as Martha reached for her purse, extracting a simple flip phone. "I should call him. He must be worried sick." The call was brief. Martha's side of the conversation consisted mostly of reassurances and apologies, ending with directions to Maggie's small home on the outskirts of Pinewood Valley. "He'll be here in about 2 hours," Martha said, closing the phone with a sigh. "He was up all night calling hospitals and police stations." Maggie nodded, rising to prepare breakfast with what little she had. As she whisked eggs in the kitchen, She wondered what kind of man would arrive at her door. The successful businessman Martha had described with pride, or the nephew who'd abandoned his family in their time of need. The black SUV appeared like an alien spacecraft against the rustic backdrop of Maggie's property. Its tires crunched over the gravel driveway, coming to a precise stop beside her weathered pickup truck. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Polished urban wealth beside mountain resilience. Robert Bobby Reynolds emerged from the vehicle with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored coat that had likely cost more than Maggie's monthly expenses, he scanned the property with piercing blue eyes, Martha's eyes, before striding toward the porch where Maggie stood waiting. "You must be Ms. Walsh," he said, his tone professionally polite but underlined with suspicion. "I understand my grandmother and nephew spent the night here." Before Maggie could respond, the front door burst open and Sam ran out, wrapping his arms around Bobby's waist. For a moment, the businessman's facade cracked, revealing genuine affection as he knelt to embrace the boy. "Are you okay, buddy?" Bobby asked, checking Sam for injuries. "I'm fine. Maggie gave me hot chocolate and told me stories about the mountains," Sam replied. "Grandma got sick, but Maggie took care of her like a real doctor." Bobby's gaze returned to Maggie, reassessing her. "You have medical training?" "I was a nurse in Boston before—" She gestured vaguely to the mountains surrounding them, a shorthand for the life choices that had brought her here. Martha appeared in the doorway, supported by Dylan, who had appointed himself her official helper after waking to find strangers in his home. "Robert," Martha called, her voice stronger than it had been all night. "Don't you dare give this woman a hard time. She took us in when she barely has enough for herself." Bobby's expression shifted subtly. He helped Martha to the SUV, settling her comfortably in the passenger seat before returning to where Maggie waited. "I'd like to compensate you for your trouble," he said, reaching for his wallet. Maggie straightened her spine, dignity rising above her worn clothes and the obvious poverty of her surroundings. "That's not necessary, Mr. Reynolds. Please, I insist. In Blue Ridge, we help each other because that's how we survive," she said firmly, "not for payment." Something flickered in Bobby's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or surprise at being refused. As he turned to leave, his gaze caught on the handcrafted items visible through Maggie's front window. Quilts with intricate patterns, woven tapestries depicting mountain landscapes, hand-carved wooden ornaments. "Did you make these?" he asked, stepping closer to examine a quilt with a distinctive star pattern. "Yes," Maggie replied. "It's an old Appalachian design, Star of Bethlehem, but with modifications that were common among the women in these mountains during the Civil War." Bobby reached out, his fingers hovering over the fabric without touching it. "My grandmother had one like this. She used to wrap me in it when I was a child." He turned to face Maggie directly. "This is exceptional work." For a moment, the professional mask fell away completely, revealing something vulnerable and authentic. Then, just as quickly, it returned. He reached into his jacket, retrieving a business card. "I have a friend in the industry who might be interested in your work," he said casually, not mentioning his own company. "May I take your contact information?" Maggie accepted the card with a raised eyebrow, but provided her email address, the one she used for her small online shop. With curt thanks and promises to keep in touch about Martha's condition, Bobby departed, the SUV disappearing around the mountain bend as quickly as it had arrived. Where are you listening from today? Our audience spans from Florida to Washington State, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Now let's continue our story. 1 week later, Maggie sat staring at her ancient laptop screen, reading the email for the 4th time. "Dear Ms. Walsh, Heritage Craft Collections would like to invite you to our Roanoke office to discuss a potential business opportunity regarding your traditional Appalachian handcrafts." A quick internet search had revealed what Bobby Reynolds had concealed. He wasn't connected to the industry. He was the industry. Heritage Craft Collections was one of the largest distributors of artisanal products in the country, with boutiques in major cities and an international online presence. Emma's newest prescription sat on the table beside the computer, $127 that Maggie didn't have. The heating bill lay beneath it, stamped with a final notice. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Borrowing gas money from her neighbor and wearing her only good outfit, a navy dress she'd last worn to a funeral 3 years ago, Maggie made the 2-hour drive to Roanoke. The Heritage Craft Collections office occupied the top floor of a renovated historic building downtown, its interior a careful balance of rustic charm and corporate efficiency. Bobby Reynolds didn't seem surprised to see her, though his assistant certainly raised an eyebrow at Maggie's worn shoes and outdated purse. "Ms. Walsh," Bobby greeted her, rising from behind an impressive desk crafted from reclaimed barnwood. "Thank you for coming." The business proposal was straightforward. Heritage would purchase Maggie's crafts at wholesale prices for distribution in their stores. The contract laid before her offered financial security she hadn't known in years, but at a cost she hadn't anticipated. "So you want me to simplify the patterns?" Maggie asked, scanning the production requirements. "Remove the hand-stitched details? Those elements are time-consuming and drive up the cost," Bobby explained. "Our market research shows customers appreciate the aesthetic but aren't willing to pay for the extra hours of craftsmanship." Maggie's fingers traced the sample quilt she'd brought, a piece that had taken her weeks to complete, incorporating techniques passed down through 6 generations of mountain women. "Each stitch tells part of our story," she said quietly. "These aren't just pretty patterns. This star formation represents safe houses on the Underground Railroad. These small variations in the border? They're family markers, ways for scattered relatives to recognize each other's work during times of war and displacement." Bobby leaned back, studying her with newfound interest. "I wasn't aware." "Most people aren't," Maggie replied. "That's the problem. I can't sell the soul of the women who taught me this craft just to make it more marketable." The meeting ended with polite but firm impasse. Maggie drove away from Roanoke with her dignity intact but her future no more certain than before. Halfway home in the midst of an unseasonable snowstorm, her truck's engine sputtered and died on a desolate stretch of mountain road. With no cell service and miles from any house, Maggie sat behind the wheel, weighing her options as darkness descended. The familiar black SUV appeared like an apparition through the swirling snow, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Bobby Reynolds stepped out, his expensive shoes immediately sinking into slush. "Car trouble?" he asked, approaching her window. Maggie sighed. "What are you doing up here?" "I have a meeting with a woodworker in Cedar Falls," he replied, peering under her hood. "Follow up from our craft fair last month." Working together in the fading light, they managed a temporary repair, enough to get her truck to the next town. As they worked, the formal barriers between them gradually lowered. "You really believe in preserving these techniques exactly as they were?" Bobby observed. Not a question, but a realization. "These mountains have lost so much already," Maggie replied, wiping grease from her hands. "The mining jobs, the factories, the young people who leave for cities. These crafts connect us to who we were, who we still are underneath." The snowfall intensified, forcing them to take shelter in a small roadside diner. Over coffee that tasted of burnt cigarettes, Bobby Reynolds revealed pieces of himself. His childhood summers spent in these mountains before his father moved the family to Atlanta, his wife's death from cancer 5 years earlier, the complicated grief that had driven him to build his company while distancing himself from his remaining family. "I should have been there for Sam after his parents died," Bobby admitted, staring into his cup. "But seeing him, it was like looking at my brother. The brother I argued with the night before the accident. The brother I never got to apologize to." Maggie recognized the weight of unresolved guilt. She carried her own version of it. "We all have regrets, Mr. Reynolds. The question is what we do with them. Bobby, he corrected her. My grandmother calls me Robert when she's angry with me, like she was this morning. She's afraid, Maggie said. Not of the disease, though that's terrifying enough. She's afraid of becoming a burden. How do you know that? Because that's every parent's fear, Maggie replied. That we'll become a weight our children have to carry rather than a support they can lean on. As they talked, a realization dawned on both of them simultaneously. Martha's journey to the cemetery near Pinewood Valley hadn't been random. She'd deliberately chosen to visit her son's grave on his wedding anniversary near where Maggie lived. It was as if some part of her had been trying to bridge the gap between the fragments of her family, even as her memory failed her. Bobby drove Maggie home, following her truck to ensure she arrived safely. Before leaving, he made a new proposal. Not a business contract, but a partnership. Instead of mass production, what about a workshop? A place where Maggie could teach traditional techniques to others in the community, with Heritage providing materials and purchasing completed pieces at fair market value. You preserve the craft, he explained, and we help preserve the community. Maggie thought of the empty storefront in town, once a hardware store, vacant since the mining operation scaled back. I might know just the place. 3 months passed in a flurry of activity. The old Pinewood hardware store transformed into Appalachian Heritage Workshop, its large windows now displaying handcrafted treasures instead of tools. 5 local women, all former Milltown employees, formed the first class, learning techniques their grandmothers might have known, but that had skipped a generation in the rush toward modernity. Martha became the workshop's honorary storyteller, sitting in a rocking chair by the fireplace, sharing the history behind each pattern as Maggie demonstrated the techniques. These sessions became a form of therapy for Martha. The stories she remembered best were the oldest ones, tales from her childhood about quilting circles and community barn raisings. Bobby visited regularly, bringing Sam to spend time with Martha, while he attended to business calls in the small office he'd established in the back of the workshop. The boy thrived in the mountains, making friends with Dylan and Emma, learning to carve wood and identify bird calls. Maggie's creations evolved beyond simple crafts into historical art pieces, each accompanied by a small card explaining its significance in Appalachian culture. These pieces commanded premium prices in Heritage's urban galleries, bringing unexpected prosperity to Maggie's modest home. Emma's medical bills no longer caused midnight panic attacks, and the house finally received the repairs it had needed for years. But success brought its own challenges. A prominent magazine featured the workshop in an article about the revival of traditional crafts, triggering a flood of orders that far exceeded their production capacity. We need to expand, Bobby insisted during one of his visits. Hire more people, increase output. Maggie hesitated. I'm worried about losing the quality, the authenticity. Then we need a different approach entirely, she continued, an idea taking shape. What about an Appalachian Artisans Network? We train people in specific techniques, maintain quality standards, but each artisan works independently, preserving the individual nature of true handcrafting. Bobby considered the concept from a business perspective. It's unorthodox, but it could work, not just as a charitable project, but as a sustainable business model. Their planning session was interrupted by a phone call. Martha had suffered a severe episode at home with her caretaker. She recognized no one, not even Sam, and had become increasingly agitated. At the hospital, Bobby's fear manifested as anger. This is too much for her, he snapped at Maggie in the waiting room. All this activity, the storytelling, the constant stream of new people, it's overwhelming her. The doctors said engagement would help slow the progression, Maggie countered. Well, they were wrong, Bobby retorted, the controlled businessman giving way to the frightened grandson. I'm losing her, don't you understand? She's the only mother I've really known, and she's disappearing right in front of me. The argument escalated, both of them releasing emotions that had been building beneath the surface of their professional partnership. Maggie revealed her fear of failing the people who depended on her, just as she felt she'd failed her marriage. Bobby confessed his terror of being too late again, too late to reconcile with his brother, too late to truly know his grandmother before her memories faded completely. In the aftermath of their conflict, Maggie withdrew from the project. She returned Bobby's investment money and focused solely on caring for Martha, who had asked to stay in Pinewood Valley rather than return to Atlanta. Without expecting compensation, Maggie converted her small guest room into a space for Martha, using her nursing background to provide the care the elderly woman needed. A week passed before Bobby reappeared on Maggie's porch, humbled by what he'd learned from Martha's doctors, that her participation in the workshop had actually been beneficial, providing cognitive stimulation that likely slowed her decline. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth. "I blamed you because it was easier than accepting what's happening." Martha, sitting nearby in the porch swing, chuckled softly. "You know, Bobby, we're all trying to control things we simply can't. Sometimes you have to learn to let go and trust." Which traditional values do you think most need preserving today? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button if this story has touched your heart. 6 months later, the historic Pinewood Valley Courthouse, vacant for a decade after county services consolidated, reopened its doors as the Appalachian Heritage Center. The imposing stone building now housed workshops, exhibition space, a retail store, and a small museum dedicated to preserving mountain craft traditions. Martha, though physically frailer, maintained her role as the center's historical librarian, recording her stories and memories of traditional crafts for future generations. When her condition permitted, she still sat by the fireplace, sharing tales with visitors who came from across the country to learn about authentic Appalachian craftsmanship. Bobby had purchased a house on the ridge overlooking the valley, bringing Sam to live permanently near his grandmother. The city executive gradually adapted to mountain rhythms, trading his tailored suits for flannel and denim, though he never lost the sharp business acumen that had built his company. Maggie found herself at the center of a revival, not just of traditional crafts, but of the community itself. The Heritage Center created 25 jobs in a town that had been losing population for decades. Tourism increased, bringing life to the main street where vacant storefronts had stood as monuments to economic decline. On the day of the center's grand opening, Maggie stood in the entrance hall, watching as visitors explored exhibits of quilting frames, spinning wheels, and looms rescued from barns and attics across 3 states. Her children moved confidently through the crowd, Dylan explaining wood-carving techniques to tourists, Emma helping younger children try simple weaving patterns. A middle-aged man in worn work clothes approached hesitantly, cap in hand. "Ma'am," he began, his coal country accent thick with pride and uncertainty. "I heard you might be teaching traditional carpentry. Lost my job at the mine last month, but my granddaddy was a furniture maker. Thought maybe—" Maggie smiled warmly. "We always have room for another artisan here." That evening, as the celebration wound down, Maggie and Bobby stood on the wide stone steps of the Heritage Center, watching the sunset paint the Blue Ridge Mountains in hues of purple and gold. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You know what I've realized?" Bobby said quietly. "Sometimes we have to get lost to find the right path." Maggie squeezed his hand in return, her eyes on the village below, where lights were beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars. "And sometimes," she replied, "we have to learn to open the door, even in the middle of a storm." Behind them, through the open doors of the Heritage Center, Martha's voice carried clearly as she told a circle of enthralled visitors about the secret messages woven into quilt patterns during the Civil War. Stories of courage, resistance, and hope stitched into fabric when words were too dangerous to speak aloud. Her memory might be fading, but the stories she carried would endure, passed from hand to hand like the precious crafts they all worked to preserve. In the gentle mountain twilight, past and present, wove together like threads in a master weaver's hands, creating a tapestry more beautiful and resilient than any single strand could achieve alone.